Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 47, The American Civil War, Part 4. It always goes back to the vices. Humans' penchant for sex and drugs is insatiable, and this was no different during the Civil War. While most historians aim to stay in their ivory towers, I will always emphatically choose to remain in the gutters. The cesspool is where we see the true desires and motivations of the actors of history. Trends that we see today can be traced back to the 1860s, from legal sex work to the use of opiates as painkillers. There's an internet meme that I have seen several times in the past few years, which gives me a good chortle. It involves an image of several A1 bottles and, in bold font, states, "So in the middle of the Civil War, someone was like, you know what this country needs? A good steak sauce." The joke is that A1 steak sauce was invented in 1862 during the American Civil War. Actually, it was sold in 1861 as a condiment for meat and game dishes in the United Kingdom. The makers introduced the product to Canada and later to the US, where it was marketed as steak sauce, but that's not important. What is essential to remember is that people do not stop being people during significant historical events. They most likely seem to lean in more. Whatever lives in your brain, stomach, or veins is what defines you. As we review this time, make sure not to clutch your pearls too tight.
Native Americans and the Civil War. The American Civil War spilled over into Indian Territory. It profoundly divided tribal nations, societies, and households on the western frontier of the war. A calculated 20,000 Indian soldiers partook in the conflict, fighting for both sides. At the onset of the war, many nations in the Indian Territory signed treaties with the Confederacy, backed by a minority of wealthy slave-holding Indians within their communities. But that compassion wasn't monolithic. Many Indians leaned toward abolitionism and supported sovereign autonomy. As the war advanced, the impetus shifted as 3 Indian Home Guard regiments appeared to support the Union and defend vulnerable tribal communities from violent guerrilla warfare. The result, Indians fighting Indians in a white man's war. While Native American soldiers went to battle for various reasons, to support or fight slavery, defend tribal autonomy, and protect family and community, the war did little to promote their needs and interests. Instead, it deepened long-standing inner tribal strains and devastated the territory the U.S. government had resettled them to decades earlier, creating a new wave of destitute refugees. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Indian Territory encompassed most of the area now populated by the state of Oklahoma. Ancestral home to tribal nations including Osage, Quapaw, Seneca, and Shawnee, it had also become the mandated home for the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. Between 1830 and 1850, those groups had been forcibly expelled from their ancestral lands in the southeast and marched hundreds of miles west by the U.S. government. The relocation, later known as the Trail of Tears, killed thousands. The Cherokee Nation, politically divided since the turbulent period, demonstrated how tribal nations were further torn apart by the war. On one side stood Principal Chief John Ross, the leader who had steered the country through the Trail of Tears. Supported by nearly a 2/3 majority, he insisted on neutrality and national unity as the secessionist sway grew in and around Indian Territory. His supporters, organized as the Ketawa Society, supported abolitionism but were roused by national sovereignty and the desire for a self-determined Cherokee identity. On the other side, a minority of wealthy slave-holding Cherokees profoundly resented Ross and his failure to align with the Confederacy. Their leader was Stand Watie, longtime head of the Treaty Party, so called because its members, in defiance of the majority, illegally signed the treaty that forced the removal of Cherokees from their homelands. In October of 1861, Ross conceded to growing pressure. He signed a treaty with the Confederate States of America, which pledged the Cherokee Nation protection, food, and other resources in exchange for several regiments' worth of soldiers and access into their territory for building roads and forts. Disliked by most Cherokees, the treaty allowed Ross to maintain governmental strength and stay in power. Several months earlier, Watie had worked discreetly with the Confederacy to form a Cherokee Mounted Rifles regiment, rallying several hundred supporters. After the treaty, the 2nd Regiment of Cherokee Mounted Rifles began under the command of Ross loyalist Colonel John Drew, a counterbalance to Watie's growing strength and leverage. Meanwhile, a 3rd political force began to muster, the Loyal Indians, led by Creek Chief Apothlear Hollow, a tenacious champion of Indian neutrality in the White Man's War. Declining to ally with the Confederates, he led thousands of followers from numerous tribes. He escaped enslaved people and freedmen to exile in Union-controlled Kansas, where the U.S. government had pledged sanctuary. Along the way, through the fall and winter of 1861, the group survived harsh conditions and guarded against repeated attacks from Confederate forces, including Watie's Cherokee Mounted Rifles. But many Cherokees in Drew's regiment, understanding of the Loyal Indians, deserted the Confederacy to join his camp, proof of the deepening divide between pro-Confederate and pro-Union Indians. By spring of 1862, James G. Blunt, Brigadier General of the Kansas Union Forces, wanted to raise an Indian expeditionary force to infiltrate Confederate-ridden Indian territory. Intel had encouraged his belief that the Cherokee's principal chief Ross was not only sympathetic to the North but could be persuaded to abandon his Confederate alliance. So, Blunt ordered the mustering of a 1st Kansas Indian Home Guard regiment encompassing refugees and survivors of Apothlear Hollow's camp of Loyal Indians. The unit included nearly 1,800 men, primarily Creeks and Seminoles. Later, a 2nd regiment was raised from almost 1,500 men, mostly Creeks, Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Osages. The 1st Home Guard expedition soon made its way through Indian territory toward Tahlequah, the Cherokee Nation capital, and Park Hill, Ross's home. After repelling Watie's regiment at the Cowskin Prairie, routing a more significant Confederate force in the Battle of Locust Grove, and capturing Fort Gibson, they successfully claimed the interior of the Cherokee Nation. The resounding Union victory spread quickly, attracting nearly 1,500 recruits to the Kansas Indian Home Guard overall, including more than 600 deserters from Drew's Cherokee Mounted Rifles. The influx prompted mounting a new 3rd Kansas Regiment, the core of which came from deserters from Drew's Confederate company, virtually gutting it as a fighting force. Ross tried to remain faithful to his treaty alliance. But after Blunt dispatched a force of 1,500 to escort him to Fort Leavenworth, the chief and the general quickly minted their agreement. Ross would proceed directly to Washington to meet with President Abraham Lincoln to discuss a continued alliance with the United States. After the Home Guard withdrew, Watie's regiment of nearly 700 strong began reprisals that ravaged Cherokee society. The war in and around Indian Territory raged through the fall and winter of 1862. The Indian Home Guard regiments redeployed in Kansas and Missouri, then moved back into Indian Territory to serve as a vital fighting force in at least 4 separate battles. The Battle of Newtonia saw Indian units on both sides of the conflict. In 1863, representatives from the Cherokee National Council beseeched for another Union military offensive to quell the continuing terrorism imposed by Watie and his Confederate force. But while General Blunt's command made several forays into Indian Territory that spring and summer, it couldn't deliver lasting peace. On May 21st, the rebel Indians under the command of Stand Watie entered the territory. They burglarized the women and children of everything they could find, robbing, sometimes slaughtering, and burning, continued until the 4th day of July without lessening. Union forces dealt a decisive blow to the rebels in Indian Territory in July 1863 at the Battle of Honey Springs, where they wasted a unified Confederate presence. The defeat forced many Southern sympathizing families to move to Texas for the course of the war, including Watie's wife and children. But after another Union exit left the countryside unprotected, Watie's group returned to plunder and steal, along with white settlers who traveled into Indian Territory from Arkansas. Many families were compelled to flee to Fort Gibson for safety. Officials noted that more than 6,000 refugees were camped within a mile and a half of the fort by the end of the year. Cherokees and other Indians experienced immense misery through the war's end due to U.S. support failures, disease, and guerrilla warfare. When the Union won the battle and the Indian Home Guard dissolved in May of 1865, the Cherokee Nation was devoid and devastated, its people's strength infinitely strained. The legacy of the Civil War emerges a few years after the Civil War. In 1867, the Kiowas ran their nominee, Lewis Downing, who had been part of the Indian Home Guard after being in Drew's regiment first. He ran in opposition to the established Ross Party candidate, William P. Ross, nephew of John Ross.
Sex and the Civil War. At camp, barracks favorites were available. These were cheap novels of a sexual nature. Photographs of nudity were also available and bought by both enlisted men and officers. These 12 by 15-inch pictures cost $1.20 for a dozen, or 10 cents for a single image. These were usually pictures of nude women doing indecent things. Naked women engaging in actual sexual activity were usually not white, but either black or Native American. With the soldiers being far away from their wives and sweethearts, it is assumed that they were used for masturbation, not just amusement. Only 3 of the novels are still known to exist. They are located at the Kinsey Institute of Indiana University. However, this is not to say females were not open to sex. Prostitutes were among the camp followers tailing behind the marching troops. Popular myth has it that they were so common around the Army of the Potomac when Union General Joseph Hooker was in command that the term hooker was coined to describe them. However, the term has been in use since 1845. The number of prostitutes around Hooker's division only cemented the word. This led to many cases of venereal disease. There were 74,000 syphilis cases among white Union soldiers and 110,000 gonorrhea cases. The total rate of venereal disease among the white Union troops was 82 cases per 1,000 men, whereas before and after the war, the rate was 87 per 1,000. Union black troops, however, had a rate of 34 per 1,000 for syphilis and 34 per 1,000 for gonorrhea. Cases were most noticeably around larger cities like Nashville, New Orleans, Richmond, and Washington, D.C. Numbers for Confederates were unspecified, but are considered less due to the Confederate soldiers being less likely to be in cities. Prostitution underwent its most substantial growth during the war. Some historians have guessed that this growth can be attributed to a recession and the need for women to sustain themselves and their families while their husbands were away at war. Other historians believe the evolution of prostitution led to the women desiring to spread venereal disease to the opposing troops. The term public women was coined for women that became prostitutes. There was moral rage at this rising career, and the law officials categorized the people they arrested as such. After the outbreak of war, the number of brothels soared. In 1864, there were 450 brothels in Washington and over 75 brothels in nearby Alexandria, Virginia. A newspaper calculated there were 5,000 public women in the district and another 2,500 in Alexandria and Georgetown, carrying the total to 7,500 by the war's third year. Regardless, the towns were located outside of the camps where prostitution was most noticeable. These small towns were overspread by the sex trade when Army troops set up nearby headquarters. One soldier wrote home to his wife, "It is said that 1 house in every 10 is a bawdy house. It is a perfect Sodom." The most infamous area for prostitution was Tennessee. Before the outbreak of the war, Nashville recorded 207 prostitutes. However, in 1863, reports claimed to have now been at least 1,500 prostitutes. The area where these prostitutes can be found was known as Smoky Row. In a notorious campaign to rid the city of the public women, Lieutenant Colonel George Spaulding loaded the women into the steamboat Idaho. Officials sent the women to Louisville, where they were not permitted off the ship, and to Cincinnati. Many women became sick due to the lack of food and were forced to turn around and return to Nashville. Once they arrived back in Nashville, Lieutenant Colonel Spaulding made a registration system like European ones. He inadvertently built the first legal system of prostitution. This is the set of regulations he set up. 1. A license is given to each prostitute, a record of which was to be kept at this office, together with the number of streets of the residence. 2. That one expert surgeon be selected as a board of examination whose duty it was to examine personally every week each licensed prostitute, giving certificate wellness to those who were healthy and ordering into hospital those in the slightest degree diseased. 3. That a building appropriate for a hospital for the invalids was to be taken for the goal that a weekly tax of 50 cents was to be charged on each prostitute to defray the hospital's expense. 4. That all public women found plying their vocation without a license and certificate were to be at once apprehended and detained in the workhouse for no less than 30 days. 5. Prostitution encountered significant expansion and spread across the North and South and was one of the few industries to cross enemy lines throughout the war. Some soldiers engaged in acts of rape. The Confederate records were destroyed, but a perusal of only 5% of Federal records reveals that over 30 court-martial trials were held due to examples of rape, hanging or firing squad being the usual punishment if condemned. Occasionally, offering money for sex to a white woman of good standing was considered almost equivalent to rape. In the case of an Illinois private at Camp Dennison, for instance, the perpetrator spent a month at the guardhouse for offering a mother $1 and her daughter $3 for sex. Federal troops who committed rape were invading the southern states mostly took advantage of black rather than white women, and black soldiers were usually disciplined more harshly for the crime than their white counterparts. Even so, the fear of rape was ubiquitous among white southern women facing the possibility of invasion without male defense. Nevertheless, the exact number of victims are hard to trace, and the threat of sexual violence committed by Union soldiers stayed in Southern cultural memory long after the war ended. On the 24th of April, 1863, Union President Abraham Lincoln signed the Lieber Code, which, amongst other things, included one of the first explicit prohibitions on rape. Paragraphs 44 and 47 of the Lieber Code contained provisions prohibiting several crimes, including all rape by an American soldier in a hostile country against its inhabitants under the penalty of death, or such severe punishment as it may deem adequate for the gravity of the offense. Thus, the only enforcement mechanism were the military commanders themselves, having the right to execute the soldiers instantly.
Food and the Civil War. During the Civil War, inexperience was the primary culinary concern for the North and the South. Men of this time were familiarized with the women of the house or enslaved women preparing the food. For a male army soldier, cooking was an unfamiliar concept. Thrust into the gloomy reality of war, soldiers were compelled to adjust to the new way of life and eat on the battleground. In the early stages of the war, the Union soldiers of the North profited from oversight by the United States Sanitary Commission. Typically known as the Sanitary, it prioritized the soldiers' health and nourishment. Even before the start of the war, volunteers in the Sanitary were trained to find and disperse food to soldiers stationed in the field. They were expected to determine which foods were available each season and how to preserve food items for transportation and storage. The Sanitary was burdened with schedule and maintaining a constant food supply to soldiers at war. During the Civil War, Union and Confederate soldiers didn't have a lot of options. They had to make do with the food they were given, called rations. Food was not always easy to get because of the war. Most soldiers were pleased to get food frequently, even if it was the same. The most common food given to soldiers was bread, coffee, and salt pork. The typical ration for every Union soldier was about a pound of meat and a pound of bread or flour. The Confederacy started following the same rules. As the war went on, they couldn't keep up. The war made it harder, particularly for the South. The Union blocked southern ports and railroads, which made getting food to Confederate soldiers difficult. Confederate soldiers were more likely to get cornbread or cornmeal than flour or bread. Corn was a local crop and easier to get. The primary bread for most Union troops was hardtack. It is made of only flour and water and looks much like a cracker. It does not rot fast. Law said that some of the hardtack used during the Civil War was left over from the Mexican-American War. Sometimes the hardtack might have worms or weevils in it. The soldiers made do by boiling it in coffee. The weevils floated to the top, and the soldiers scraped them off. This made hardtack more flavorful and solved the bug issue. Coffee was integral to troops. It gave the soldiers energy after long days of working or marching. It was also the safest thing to drink. Insufficient drinking water made many people sick. More soldiers died from disease than battle. They were boiling the water to make coffee, killing the bacteria that made them sick. Most soldiers didn't know about germs and bacteria, but they saw that drinking coffee was scrumptious and safe. Because the Union blocked imports to the Confederacy, they didn't always have coffee. Confederate soldiers made do by boiling a flower root called chicory and other plants they could find to create a warm drink. Salt pork was the most common meat ration. It was like bacon and held by using a lot of salt. Salt pork was even saltier. They had to scrape the salt off and soak it in water or partially boil it first to make it palatable. Soldiers could save the leftover salt for later to season another meal. Troops sometimes received additional rations like beans, rice, sugar, and dried vegetables or fruit. Troops on both sides scoured for fresh food from homes and farms. Some officers also bought food for their company if they were able. But mainly, living on hardtack, coffee, and pork was not very nutritional. Many soldiers got scurvy, an illness caused by not getting enough vitamins. Despite this, soldiers got innovative. They came up with different recipes that used the same ingredients. Several recipes were printed in military handbooks to help soldiers find variety. They made stews with hardtack, which would thicken the soup. If they had it, soldiers used flour to create several things. They made gravy with leftover grease from cooking meat. One drummer boy wrote about wrapping dough made of flour and water around his bayonet and cooking it over the fire. By summer 1861, the Union naval blockade effectively shut down the export of cotton, and the import of manufactured goods. Food that formerly came overland was cut off. Women had charge of making do. They cut back on purchases, brought out old spinning wheels, and broadened their gardens with peas and peanuts to provide clothing and food. They used artificial substitutes when possible, but there was no real coffee, and it was hard to develop a taste for the okra or chicory substitutes used. The households were severely hurt by inflation in the cost of everyday items, food shortages, fodder for the animals, and medical supplies for the injured. The Georgia legislature imposed cotton quotas, making it a crime to grow in excess. But food shortages only deepened, particularly in the towns. The overall reduction in food supplies, made worse by the collapsing transportation system, led to severe droughts and high prices in urban areas. When bacon reached $1 a pound in 1863, the poor women of Richmond, Atlanta, and many other cities began to riot. They broke into shops and warehouses to seize food. The women were angry at inefficient state relief efforts, speculators, merchants, and planters. As wives and widows of soldiers, they were hurt by the flawed welfare system.
Medicine and the Civil War. As was customary in the 19th century, more soldiers died of disease in the Civil War than in battle. Injuries, illness, and mishap temporarily hindered even more significant numbers. The war dramatically affected American medicine, from surgical procedures to hospitals to nursing and research facilities. Conditions were poor in the Confederacy, where doctors and medical supplies were in short supply. The hygiene of the training and field camps was inadequate, particularly at the beginning of the war, when men who had seldom been far from home being brought together for training with thousands of strangers. First came epidemics of the childhood diseases of chickenpox, mumps, whooping cough, and, specifically, measles. Operations in the South meant an unsafe new disease environment, carrying diarrhea, dysentery, typhoid fever, and malaria. The surgeons prescribed coffee and whiskey. Harsh weather, bad water, insufficient shelter in winter quarters, poor sanitation within the camps, and the dirty camp hospitals took their toll. This was a common scenario in wars, and the conditions faced by the Confederate Army were even worse. The Union answered by building hospitals in every state. The emergence of skilled, well-funded medical organizers who took aggressive action was unlike the Union, particularly in the much enlarged United States Army Medical Department, and the United States Sanitary Commission, a new private agency. Other new agencies also targeted soldiers' medical and moral needs, including the United States Christian Commission, and smaller private agencies such as the Women's Central Association of Relief for Sick and Wounded in the Army, founded in 1861 by Henry Whitney Bellows and Dorothy Dix. Systematic funding appeals grew public consciousness, as well as millions of dollars. Many thousands of volunteers worked in the hospitals and rest homes, most famously poet Walt Whitman. Frederick Law Olmsted, a famous landscape architect, was the highly efficient executive director of the Sanitary Commission. States could use their own tax money to support their troops. Following the unanticipated slaughter at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, the Ohio state government sent 3 steamboats to the scene as drifting hospitals with doctors, nurses, and medical supplies. The state fleet grew to 11 hospital ships. The state also set up 12 local offices in central transportation nodes to help Ohio soldiers move back and forth. The U.S. Army learned many lessons, and in 1886 it founded the Hospital Corps. The Sanitary Commission gathered tremendous amounts of statistical data and opened the problems of storing information for fast access and mechanically searching for data patterns. The pioneer was John Shaw Billings. A senior surgeon in the war, Billings built the Library of the Surgeon General's office. Billings figured out how to mechanically examine medical and demographic data by turning it into numbers and punching them into cardboard cards as developed by his assistant Herman Hollerith. The origin of the computer punch card system that dominated statistical data manipulation until the 1970s.
Opium. Opium is a dried, sappy substance harvested from the opioid poppy seed pod. In its raw form, it had long been observed as a powerful pain reliever, and several of its component alkaloid substances, which include morphine, codeine, and thebaine, would ultimately serve as building blocks for the synthesis of many household drugs, including those for diarrhea, insomnia, bronchitis, and psychosis. The United States legally imported opium for more than 100 years. By 1858, historians noted that 300,000 pounds of opium came to America each year. Historians record that the American Civil War was the turning point for widespread misuse of opiates. Opium-based drugs, including morphine, provided powerful relief for veterans suffering from physical pain and mental illness. During the Civil War, military hospitals believed opioids to be necessary medicine. Doctors and nurses used opium and morphine to treat soldiers' pain, stop internal bleeding, and mitigate vomiting and diarrhea induced by infectious diseases. However, this led some soldiers to develop opioid dependencies, either during the war or after seeking medical treatment for wartime injuries or illnesses. For many Civil War veterans, opioid dependencies were life-ruining. Veterans' dependency made them tired and emaciated and could lead to a lethal overdose. In some cases, opioid addiction could jeopardize a veteran's capacity to receive a pension. In 1895, a Union veteran named Charles L. Williams stated in an application to a soldier's home that he was totally unable to earn a living since he had contracted the opium habit during the war. By the time Williams applied to the soldier's home, the scope of the problem had grown beyond veterans. America was during its first major opioid crisis, fueled by the rise of injectable morphine that some doctors had begun distributing during the Civil War. The same plight of veterans helped draw attention to the issue, raising awareness among doctors and the public about the dangers of opioid addiction. Opioid use has a long history in the United States. Before the Civil War, doctors prescribed opium pills and laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol. These opiates, or natural opioids, were available in many drugstores without a prescription. When the war began, the Union and the Confederacy considered it essential to stock their hospitals with drugs. A Confederate medical handbook said, "Opium is the indispensable drug on the battlefield, important to the surgeon, as gunpowder to the ordnance." In addition to opium and laudanum, some Union doctors started using the hypodermic syringe, a relative invention, to inject another opioid, morphine, straight into soldiers' veins. These doctors realized that this invention that hadn't been used widely in the US could now be a godsend in hospitals because it delivers morphine immediately. Injectable morphine provided quicker relief than opium pills and laudanum but was more likely to lead to addiction. In addition to soldiers, Civil War doctors took opioids to treat infectious diseases and deal with the stress of working in army hospitals, leading them to develop addictions before and after the war. A Union surgeon named J.M. Richards would later recall how he had developed chronic diarrhea during the war and at last resorted to frequent doses of morphine as the only sure means of controlling the difficulty. Notably, black veterans mainly did not develop an opioid addiction, owing to differences in medical care provided to black and white men. Black soldiers systematically declined the same medical care that white soldiers received. Doctors didn't offer black soldiers the same opioids as white soldiers, who began to refer to their addiction, apparently without sarcasm, as opium slavery. When veterans returned home after the war, they persisted in taking opium and injectable morphine, which became more available in the 1870s. The Civil War helped mainstream the use of the hypodermic syringe. Doctors who used it during the war taught their colleagues about injectable morphine, leading more doctors to prescribe it to veterans and other patients after the war. Companies took notice and began selling injectable morphine straight to customers. By the 1870s, virtually every American physician had a hypodermic syringe. By all accounts, that was the primary driver of the significant increase in opiate addiction in the 1870s, 1880s, and early 1890s. You can get syringes and morphine quickly. You could even buy them through the mail at Sears and Roebuck, the department store. Later, the Sears and Roebuck catalog also sold heroin. The availability of injectable morphine led to a full-fledged opioid addiction crisis by the 1880s. One of the groups that helped emphasize this concern was Civil War veterans, who had now been addicted for decades. In the early 1880s, the doctor and significant opioid expert Thomas Davison Crothers met with an unidentified Union veteran with an opium addiction who had started taking the drug to treat chronic diarrhea he developed during the war. He told Crothers that he recuperated from the disease after 2 months but persisted in taking opium on and off for the next 2 decades. Crothers observed that this man had difficulty stopping taking opioids because he had formed an addiction. Stories like these helped inform medical considerations about opioid addiction as a public health issue that the U.S. continues to struggle with today.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm RyanGLancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.